Hey everyone, today I thought I'd make a video about what I think is one of the most important concepts on all of the LSAT, a concept that if you're good at it will serve you well on all the sections, on arguments, on reading, and on games. It's something I think you just need to know and know really well, and it is the difference between necessary conditions and sufficient conditions. As you probably know, on the argument section, they have assumption necessary questions, assumption sufficient. So it's such a big concept that they have whole question types on the argument section. It's also helpful on the reading, and it's helpful on games too when you deal with conditional rules and symbolizing. So it's just something that's generally very helpful for the LSAT. And instead of talking today about, oh, well, these are the steps for this type of question, that type of question, for example, on the arguments, assumption sufficient versus necessary, I thought I would just talk more generally about necessary versus sufficient conditions, because that's the thing. I think the best LSAT test takers aren't the ones who are just the ones who know how to symbolize the rules correctly or know these are the steps to a question. For this type of question, you do this. I think the best test takers are the ones who have the fullest understanding of what a concept or a rule really means. And I think sufficient versus necessary is one of these areas where we can spend a little more time thinking about it and getting a fuller grasp on it, and it's just going to make us better on all those steps that I'm talking about, symbolizing or steps to a question or whatever. So to do that, I just thought I'd keep it really simple and talk about what's the difference between the two, sufficient and necessary, and then give you an example of each. A sufficient condition is a condition that is sufficient, meaning enough, to bring about a certain result. So when you hear sufficient, think enough. It is sufficient, it is enough. A necessary condition is something that is necessary or required in order to get to a certain result. And the problem is, I think test takers, when they see a condition and it's either necessary or sufficient, they think that it is the other one, that it's both, that it's necessary and sufficient. They forget that those are two totally separate things. Like if they see a sufficient condition, they might think it's necessary. Or if they see a necessary condition, they might think it's sufficient. And that's just not the right way to go about it. That's the wrong way to go about it. And we need to keep them separate. So I'll give you an example of something that is a sufficient but not necessary condition, and then vice versa. And again, I think oftentimes when we see these things, we read these things on the LSAT, we get so locked in and we forget to separate that they're two separate things. So, for example, I'm a professor, and let's just say I walked into class on the first day, and I pointed to somebody on the first row and I said, "What's your name?" And the person said, "Well, my name's Brad." And I say, "Okay, class, tell you what, I'm in a good mood this semester. Every class that Brad comes to this whole semester, I'm going to give you extra credit that day." And the class is loving it, right? They're loving Brad. "Brad, if you come to class, I will give the class extra credit that day." Pause. Brad's coming to class is a condition. The result is extra credit. So on one side over here, on one side of the arrow would be if Brad comes to class. The other side of the arrow would be extra credit. So B arrow EC. If Brad comes, you get extra credit. But what type of condition is that? Is it necessary or sufficient? Well, imagine this, just to help you understand the answer. What if the next class Brad comes, we get extra credit. The next class he comes, you get extra credit. Let's say the next class, Brad doesn't show up. I walk in, getting ready to start class, Brad isn't there, and everybody's looking so sullen and down. And I say, "What's the problem today? Why is everybody so blue?" And they go, "Well, Brad's not here. Brad's not here today, so we're not getting extra credit." And I say, "Why aren't you getting extra credit?" And they go, "Because Brad's not here. You told us that if Brad comes, we get extra credit." And I said, "Yeah, that's exactly what I said. But did I say that that's the only way you get extra credit?" And they think about it and they go, "Well, no." And I said, "Exactly. If Brad comes to class, that is enough to give you extra credit." So that would be a sufficient condition. But I never said that it's necessary for Brad to come to class in order to give you extra credit. Why can't I give you extra credit on days that Brad doesn't come? I never took that off the table. So you see how that could trip you up on the LSAT? You get this question that says, every time Brad comes to class, the professor gives extra credit. But on Friday, Brad didn't come to class. Therefore, we won't get extra credit. Well, that's flawed thinking, because I could give you extra credit anytime I want. His coming to class is a sufficient condition. It is sufficient or enough to get extra credit. I never said it was necessary, so don't confuse the two. What about the other way? What if you get a passage that tells you that oxygen is necessary for life, that you have to have it to be alive? And then later in the passage it tells you that Brad has access to oxygen. Therefore, he will be alive, or will always be alive because he has access to oxygen. And you think, well, that makes sense. You told us that if you have oxygen, you can live, and he has oxygen, therefore he can live. Well, oxygen is necessary for life, but I never said it was enough for life. What if Brad has oxygen but no water? What if Brad has oxygen but no food? He can live for a little while without food and water, but not forever. So saying he can live on so long as he has oxygen, that's faulty thinking too, because having oxygen is a necessary condition for life, but it's not sufficient for life. It's not enough to sustain life. So I hope you see that one condition doesn't necessarily mean you have the other, and vice versa. So when you read those kind of conditions, just be super clear in your mind, okay, I recognize that this is a trigger that leads to some result, or that I've associated with some result. I've got an arrow and I've got a condition over here, and I've got a result over there. But ask yourself, is it sufficient enough to get to that result? Or is it something that's required to get to that result? Is it necessary? Do you have to have it? Two totally different things. So I encourage you to, as you prep for the LSAT, just to think more fully about necessary versus sufficient conditions, because it's a concept that, like I said, is going to help you on all of the sections. All right? Hope that helps. See you next time.